"They know we're here," said Commander Verif, studying her console with narrowed eyes. "The observation network is still active. They are tracking every ship in the formation." "Then they've chosen to do nothing," Krell said, and he almost believed his own certainty. The fleet's first target was a colony built around a frozen moon called Vethra 9, a small settlement by human standards, perhaps 40,000 inhabitants, its surface dotted with domed habitation structures and the blue-white glow of atmospheric processes. Thermal scans confirmed active power grids. Life signs registered clearly. The colony was functioning perfectly. And yet, when Alliance landing craft ascended through the thin upper atmosphere and Alliance troops moved through the airlock doors with weapons raised, they found nothing. Not devastation. Not a hastily abandoned evacuation. Not even the ordinary debris of panic. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings, vehicles crashed in the rush to leave. They found order. Stillness. Lights glowing softly in empty corridors. Meals half-eaten on tables, still faintly warm under thermal scan. A child's drawing pinned to a wall beside a door left standing open, as if the occupants had simply stepped outside for a moment and forgotten to return. The colony was pristine, quiet, and completely, utterly empty. Sergeant Daravos, one of the first Alliance soldiers through the main settlement gate, stood in the central plaza and turned slowly in a full circle, her weapon tracking nothing, her breath fogging in the recycled air. Somewhere deep in the settlement's maintenance corridors, a pipe clicked as a heating system cycled. The sound made 3 of her soldiers snap their rifles up toward empty air. "Where are they?" she whispered. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Back in orbit, the communications officers began reporting something strange. Signals across several frequencies were behaving oddly, arriving with slight delays, echoing back on themselves, folding in patterns that didn't match any known atmospheric interference model. A senior technician spent 40 minutes running diagnostics and came back with nothing. No malfunction. No source. Just signals behaving in ways that signals shouldn't. Then a patrol cruiser on the outer edge of the fleet formation, the 7th Meridian, a capable vessel with a reliable crew, reported a sense of contact. Brief. Massive. A shape that appeared at the edge of scanner range for less than a single second before vanishing completely. No energy signature where it had been. No gravitational residue. No debris. Nothing. The report was logged and quietly set aside. Equipment anomaly. Deep space was full of sensor ghosts. But Krell, standing alone at his observation window long after his officers had moved on to other concerns, found himself staring into the dark between the stars and feeling, for the first time in a very long career, that something in that darkness was staring back. The fleet pressed deeper into human space over the following days, and reality began to fray at the edges in ways that were difficult to name. It started small. Navigation signals flickered for 2 or 3 seconds at a time before stabilizing, never long enough to cause a course error, but long enough to make pilots reach for their manual controls with cold hands. Star charts updated themselves with minor corrections, tiny shifts in positional data that shouldn't have been necessary given how recently they'd been calibrated. Communications between ships began arriving with delays measured in fractions of a second, imperceptible in conversation, but deeply wrong to any engineer who understood how signal propagation worked across these distances. Officers blamed equipment stress. Deep space travel was hard on systems. These things happened. They happened 3 times in one day. Then 7. Then too many times to track. The 7th Meridian disappeared on a Tuesday. One moment it was there, a reliable green dot on the fleet tracking display, holding its position on the formation's outer ring. The next moment, it was gone. No explosion recorded by any sensor in the fleet. No distress call transmitted on any frequency. No debris field expanding outward from its last known position. The space where the 7th Meridian had existed simply contained empty space, as if the ship had been a thought that someone had quietly decided to stop thinking. Command classified it as a catastrophic systems failure, probably a reactor cascade. These things, too, happened, though they happen almost never, and never quite like this. The soldiers stationed at captured colony sites began filing incident reports that their officers didn't know how to process. Motion sensors triggering in empty storage corridors. Thermal imaging picking up heat signatures that resolved into nothing when approached. Exterior cameras recording shadows. Brief, dark, crossing frozen ground at the colony perimeters that had no visible source. One private submitted a report claiming he had heard footsteps in the sealed room and, upon opening it, found only a single set of boot prints in the fine dust that had settled on the floor. His sergeant confiscated the report and told him to get more sleep. On the flagship, a young communications officer named Saren spent an entire night bent over her console with headphones pressed to her ears, chasing something she couldn't quite hear, signals buried so deep beneath the background noise of space that she kept doubting she was hearing them at all. Complex, repeating patterns, mathematical in their structure, far too precise to be natural interference. She finally isolated a fragment long enough to run it through the analysis array. The analysis came back with a single line of output, origin point, indeterminate. Signal present across all monitored frequencies simultaneously. She reported it to Krell the next morning, her voice careful and controlled in the way voices become when the person speaking them is more frightened than they want to admit. Everywhere and nowhere, she said, when he asked her where the signals were coming from. She met his eyes for just a moment, then looked back at her console. That's the only answer the system will give me. That afternoon, the fleet's long-range scanners detected gravitational ripples moving through surrounding space, subtle disturbances in the fabric of local space-time, spreading outward from points that the scanners couldn't fix in any precise location. Like waves spreading across the surface of a still pond when a stone is dropped in, except the stone was invisible, and the pond was infinite, and the waves kept coming from every direction at once. Krell ordered the fleet into tighter formation. Weapons went to standby. Officers watched their screens with the focused, rigid attention of people who have realized they may have made a mistake but cannot yet admit it aloud. No enemy appeared. No attack came. Only silence, deeper than before, heavier. The kind of silence that has weight and temperature, that presses against the inside of the skull and makes a person understand, without being told, that they are being measured. Something was studying them, something patient and vast and unhurried, that had all the time in the universe and was in absolutely no rush to show itself. The warning came on the 6th day of the invasion. It arrived without preamble on every Alliance communications frequency simultaneously, no handshake protocol, no carrier signal, no identifying header. Just a voice, calm and clear and utterly without emotion, cutting through the static like a blade through silk. This is your final opportunity. Turn back. That was all. 6 words. Then silence. The command deck of the Eternal Dominion went very quiet. Officers exchanged glances across their consoles. Sub-Commander Verith looked at Admiral Krell with an expression that was carefully, professionally neutral, and said nothing, because she had already said what she needed to say twice, and twice had been enough. Krell's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. In 40 years of military service, no enemy had ever told him to turn back without having the weapons trained on him to make the point. And no enemy was doing so now. There was still nothing on the scanners, nothing in the space around the fleet, nothing but empty stars and silence and that single, arrogant, inexplicable transmission. "Oh, days," he began, and then the navigation systems died. Not dramatically, not in a shower of sparks or a cascade of alarm klaxons. The screens simply went dark, one by one, with a quiet finality, like candles being snuffed out by a careful hand. The flagship shuddered as its primary drive systems registered a command that no one on board had given. Throughout the fleet, the same thing was happening, 1,000 ships lurching and stumbling as the invisible architecture of their operating systems was quietly, methodically dismantled by something they couldn't see. Then the long-range scanners, the last system still functioning clearly, lit up like a supernova. They were everywhere. Human warships materialized from the darkness in every direction simultaneously, not dropping out of hyperspace with a dramatic flash of a jump drive, but simply appearing, as if they had always been there and had merely decided to stop being invisible. They were unlike anything in any Alliance database. Sleek to the point of abstraction, their hulls so dark they seemed to absorb the light of nearby stars rather than reflect it. No visible weapon arrays. No obverse engine exhaust. They moved with a silence that felt almost biological, the silence of something that had evolved to hunt in the dark and had never needed to make noise. There were hundreds of them. They surrounded the entire Alliance Armada in a formation so precise it looked less like a military maneuver and more like a mathematical proof. Every escape vector was covered. Every possible course of retreat was blocked. The human ships held their positions with absolute stillness, their weapons unlit, their communications channels dark. "Sir," said the tactical officer, and his voice had lost all of its professional composure. I can't get a reading on them. The system won't. It keeps trying to process and then returning null. It's like they're not there, except they clearly." "I can see them," Krell said quietly. He stood at the center of his command deck and looked at the holographic display that was trying and failing to map the human fleet, and felt the architecture of his certainty collapse inward on itself like a dying star. He had called them death-worlders. He had studied their patrol schedules and their light defenses and their diplomatic silence, and concluded, with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong, that he understood what they were. A quiet species, a peaceful species, a species that had somehow stumbled into space without developing the appetite for violence that real power required. He understood now what he had actually been looking at, not the absence of power, the concealment of it. Every empty colony had been emptied on purpose, not in panic, but in preparation. Civilians relocated with quiet efficiency weeks or months before the fleet had even assembled. Every sensor ghost had been a real ship. Every strange signal had been communication between a fleet that had been shadowing the Armada since the moment it crossed the border, invisible, patient, studying every formation change and tactical decision with the unhurried attention of a species that had decided, not in anger, but in cold strategic clarity, exactly how this was going to end. The 7th Meridian hadn't suffered a reactor failure. It had been shown what happened to ships that got too close to something humanity didn't want found. "They've been with us the whole time," Vera said softly, from somewhere behind him. She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. "Since before we crossed the border. Maybe, just watching, letting us come." Krell said nothing. Then the Alliance fleet's weapons systems began to shut down. Not all at once. That would have been a statement. This was something quieter and more devastating. One by one, in no apparent order, the enormous guns that had threatened entire civilizations fell silent. Missile batteries registered launch commands and then quietly declined to execute them. Shield generators hummed and then softened to a level that would stop debris, nothing more. The process took approximately 7 minutes, and for those 7 minutes, every Alliance officer on every Alliance ship watched their most formidable weapons become decorative, and felt the particular terror of understanding that whatever was doing this to them was doing it without effort. "They've hacked into our systems," someone on the command deck said, in a voice so thin it barely carried. "They're inside everything. Every system, every ship, every—" "Yes," Krell said. He sat down in the command chair. He couldn't recall the last time he had sat during a battle situation, but his legs had made the decision for him. On the holographic display, the image of his proud, motionless, helpless Armada floated in the center of a ring of dark ships that hadn't moved an inch since appearing. They weren't closing in. They weren't powering weapons. They were simply there, absolute and immovable as a geographic feature, and they were doing nothing except making it completely clear that they could do anything. Then the voice returned. It came through every speaker on every ship in the Armada at the same moment, without static, without distortion, as clear and cool as deep water. "You mistook our silence for weakness." A pause, not for dramatic effect. The voice didn't seem interested in drama. More like the pause a teacher might leave after stating a theorem, to let the logic settle. That is an error that only needs to be made once. Krell stared at the display. His fleet, his pride, 600 ships representing the absolute apex of Alliance military engineering, sitting motionless in space, as helpless as derelicts, held in place not by superior firepower but by a level of technological and strategic sophistication that made his own look like something primitive scratched on stone. They hadn't fired a single shot, not one, the most complete military victory Krell had ever witnessed, and it had been achieved entirely without violence. That, he realized, was the most frightening part. Violence he understood. Violence had rules, had limits, had a point at which the stronger side won and the weaker side surrendered and the thing was done. But this was something else. This was a demonstration given by a species that had apparently decided that the most powerful thing it could do was show him exactly what it was capable of and then choose not to use it. Mercy as a weapon. Restraint as a statement. Silence, all the way to the end. "Stand down," Admiral Krell said. His voice was barely above a whisper. He didn't need to shout. Every officer on the deck had heard him, and every officer understood, and not one of them said a word in protest. "We have lost." The human ships still didn't move. They watched the Armada with that same patient, absolute stillness, weapons cold, hulls dark, as Krell transmitted the surrender order to every ship under his command and listened to 600 acknowledgments come back to him one by one. The retreat began in silence, because silence was the only vocabulary left to the Alliance fleet. Ships toned, sluggishly, their navigation systems restored just enough to move but not enough to pose any threat. The great formation that had taken a week to assemble dissolved in under an hour, and the ships that had come to conquer human space limped back toward the border in ones and twos and small clusters, their weapons cold, their pride in ruins. The human fleet did not follow. It held its position and watched, without a word, without a shot, as the most powerful military force the Orion Alliance had deployed in a generation retreated from a border it had crossed 6 days ago with absolute certainty of victory. As the last Alliance ships cleared human space, one final transmission followed them across the border. The same voice, the same calm, but something beneath the words, not quite a warning, not quite a promise. Something that landed in the chest and stayed there. "We do not seek war. We have never sought war. The galaxy is large enough for all of us, and we would prefer to share it in peace. But understand this clearly, and carry it back to every council and every court and every commander who thought our silence was an invitation. We have been watching this galaxy for a very long time. We have been learning. We have been patient. And we are very, very good at waiting." A beat of silence. "Do not make us stop." Admiral Krell stood at the rear observation window of the Eternal Dominion as his ship crossed back into Alliance territory, and he watched human space recede behind him, the stars unchanged, the border invisible, the darkness exactly as dark as it had always been. Nothing out there looked different. Nothing out there looked dangerous. If you didn't know what was hidden in that darkness, you would see exactly what the Alliance had seen for years, a quiet species, tending their worlds, trading with their neighbors, moving through the galaxy without aggression or ambition. He knew, now, what that silence actually was. It was the sound of something that had already won, and was simply waiting for everyone else to figure that out. He turned away from the window and began composing a report he would deliver to the High Council, the report that would tell them, in the careful language of military assessment, that the Orion Alliance had encountered a civilization it did not understand, had underestimated catastrophically, and must never provoke again. He would not call them deaf-worlders in that report. He would call them, with the full weight of what he now understood, exactly what they were: patient, prepared, and the most quietly terrifying thing the galaxy had ever produced. For centuries, the galaxy had watched humanity with a mixture of curiosity and quiet dismissal. They had emerged from a world that most spacefaring civilizations would have classified as uninhabitable, a savage, unrelenting death world of volcanic storms, apex predators, and geological violence that reshaped continents on a geological whim. By every known model of civilizational development, the species that crawled out of that chaos should have been warriors, conquerors, creatures shaped entirely by the instinct to dominate or die. Instead, they traded. They mapped the forgotten corners of the galaxy and left navigation beacons for others to use freely. They established medical outposts on the margins of dying colonies and asked nothing in return. When two powerful empires clashed in the Valdris Corridor, a war that burned 3-star systems to cinders and displaced 40 million souls, humanity sent food ships and shelter modules to both sides without taking a position, without demanding recompense, without so much as requesting a formal alliance. And when those same empires later threatened human border systems, Earth said nothing, sent nothing, did nothing that anyone could see. To most of the galaxy, humanity was a peaceful enigma, admirable, perhaps, but ultimately unthreatening. To the Orion Alliance, however, silence had only ever meant one thing: weakness. Admiral Krell was not a man who doubted himself. He had conquered 14 systems across his career and reduced 3 independent civilizations to vassal states through sheer overwhelming force. He was tall by Alliance standards, broad-shouldered, his dark blue skin marked with the ceremonial ridge scars that denoted his rank. When he stood on the command deck of the Eternal Dominion, the pride of the Alliance fleet, a battleship so large it generated its own gravitational signature, he felt like a fact of the universe, immovable, inevitable. He stared at the blue-white sphere rotating on the holographic display before him, and smiled with cold amusement. "Deaf worlders," he said softly, as if commenting on the weather, "and yet they think hiding in plain sight is a strategy." His intelligence officers had been thorough. Long-range reconnaissance had revealed that human border systems were defended by patrol vessels barely worthy of the name, small, lightly armed ships that traveled in pairs, covering vast stretches of empty space on rotation schedules that even Cadet could have predicted. There were no fortified stations guarding the outer colonies, no dreadnoughts sitting in high orbit above their most populated worlds. And when Alliance scout ships had deliberately entered nearby star systems, a calculated provocation designed to measure the human response, Earth had transmitted nothing. No warning, no ultimatum, no mobilization order that any scanner could detect. They were watching, certainly. Krell's own analysts confirmed that human observation satellites tracked every Alliance ship with quiet precision. But watching was not the same as acting, and action was the only language Krell had ever respected. "They see us and they do nothing," said Subcommander Verif, standing at Krell's right shoulder. She was younger than him, sharper in certain ways, and she had said twice already, once in private, once in council, that she found humanity's silence unsettling rather than reassuring. Both times, Krell had dismissed her instincts as inexperience. Either they have no capacity to respond, or they are choosing not to. "The difference is irrelevant," Krell said. "The result is the same." The Alliance High Council had agreed with him. The vote to move had been unanimous. Humanity's territory sat along a resource corridor that the Alliance needed, rich asteroid belts, habitable moons, and a hyperspace junction point that would cut travel time between the Alliance's eastern reaches by 30%. The humans had settled there without the military power to hold it. That made their claim, in the Alliance's view, more of a suggestion than a fact. Within the week, the fleet assembled at the edge of human space. It was a staggering thing to behold. Hundreds of battleships arranged in a formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers, their hulls dark against the stars, their weapon arrays primed and glowing faintly at standby power. Carriers the size of small moons held their positions at the rear, their bays packed with invasion transports and ground assault vehicles. Support ships, resupply freighters, medical vessels, and command frigates filled the spaces between the capital ships like the organs of some vast mechanical creature. The largest military force the Alliance had assembled in 40 years. Still, Earth said nothing. No fleet emerged to face them. No emergency transmission crackled across the communication channels. The stars simply continued to burn, indifferent, and the human worlds on the other side of that invisible border continued to rotate in peaceful silence. Officers celebrated on the flight decks. Soldiers cleaned their weapons and told each other that this would be the easiest campaign of their lives. And in the darkness between the stars, in the cold, lightless spaces where no scanner swept and no eye looked, something that had been very still for a very long time began, almost imperceptibly, to move. The Orion Armada crossed into human space at 0400 Standard Time, and the universe did not react. No alarm sounded from any defense installation. No automated weapons platform swung its guns toward the incoming fleet. The border itself was invisible, a line drawn on star charts, meaningful only to the civilizations that agreed to honor it, and crossing it felt like crossing nothing at all. Krell stood at the forward observation window and watched the stars slide past. He had expected, on some irrational level, to feel something. Resistance, perhaps, a change in the quality of space itself. Something that acknowledged the enormity of what was happening. Instead, his senses showed him asteroid miners continuing their slow work on nearby rock clusters. Cargo haulers plodding between way stations on their scheduled routes. Civilian transport vessels curving around a gas giant on standard orbital approaches. Everything was normal. Everything was calm. It was, in its own quiet way, deeply wrong.